Well, good morning and welcome to the 32nd meeting this year of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Please switch off your mobile phones that can interfere with the sound system. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Jane Baxter for all her hard work during her time in the committee, now that she has left us. And in a reshuffle, Cara Hilton will replace Jane on the committee, hopefully as of next week, because we have her apologies and Claire Baker is standing in as a substitute. Welcome, Claire. And agenda item 1 today, pardon? I beg your pardon, of course, Jamie McGregor is a substitute as well for, and welcome to him for Alec Ferguson. Thank you. Agenda item 1's 2 pieces of subordinate legislation, 2 negative instruments. No motions to annul have been brought forward. One on beekeeping in Colonsay and Oronsay, Order 2013, and the Loch Sligachen, Isle of Skye, Scallops, Several Fisheries Order 2013. Do I refer members to the paper? Does anyone have any comments? Dick Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. Just to say, as a bee champion, I'm very happy with the legislation which the Government has brought forward in regards to safeguarding the black bee on Colonsay and Oronsay.
Thank you. If there's no further comments, then we agree that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments. Agreed? Thank you very much. Now, agenda item 2, Scottish Government's draft Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme. In our second item today, the committee will take evidence from the Minister in its last round of evidence on climate change adaptation for the moment. And we welcome Paul-Wheelhouse, Minister for Environment and Climate Change, and his team, Bob Irvin, Deputy Director of Climate Change and Water Industry, Helen Mansbridge, the Team Leader for Behaviour Change, and Neil Ritchie, the Head of Natural Assets and Flooding in the Scottish Government. I wonder if the Minister wishes to make any introductory remarks.
I do, Convener. I'll keep them brief. Thank you. Thank you, Convener, and thank you to the committee. We know our climate is already changing, and to meet our own climate change targets, a massive shift in behaviours is needed, changing the way we all live, work and travel. This will be challenging. We need to engage with the public on the actions we can all take together. Low carbon technologies and infrastructure will only have the desired impact if people are willing to adapt, willing and able to adapt to using them. And just as one example, installing a charging network for electric vehicles in Scotland's trunk roads, for example, won't make any difference if people don't buy or know how to use these types of vehicles. So clearly we have to provide further information for them. We are making progress on behaviours, particularly around one-off behaviours like loft insulation, installing an energy-efficient boiler, but we need to do more on everyday activities like walking short journeys and reducing food waste. The initial results of the 2 recent Greener Together campaigns, Not Far Leave the Car and Feed the Bin, are positive, with around half of people who had seen the campaigns feeling motivated to change their behaviour. Alongside this successful public engagement, we are strengthening the behavioural elements of our policies using the ISM tool. Launched in June this year, the ISM approach is already informing and strengthening RPP2 policies. Influencing behaviours is not a standalone piece of work, but it is integrated in the policies and proposals set out in RPP2 itself. And for example, the ISM approach informed Switched On Scotland, a roadmap to widespread adoption of plug-in vehicles, helping us to meet the challenge of decarbonising transport. And ISM isn't just for government. It is being used by the 2020 Climate Group. The ISM approach will be trialled with 2020 businesses who have signed up to the group's transport pledges, such as increasing travel by public transport and the uptake of fuel-efficient driving. And this will help them to maximise behaviour change themselves. An update on the Scottish Government's workshops and their outputs was published last week on the Scottish Government website, and gives further information on what we're doing to achieve the ISM to pick up across the public sector. Influencing behaviours is key to delivering a low-carbon future. However, due to past and present emissions and by the inertia of the climate system, our climate will continue to change over the coming decades. While the aggregate impacts of climate change in Scotland might be less severe than in other parts of the world, the impacts for individuals, for businesses and for communities can be distressing and damaging, and it is important that Scotland is well prepared and resilient to change. The Committee on Climate Change acknowledge that Scotland has made good progress in raising awareness about climate change and embedding adaptation into key policies. We are building on this progress through the development of Scotland's first statutory Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme, and the UK's first climate change risk assessment, published last year, shows both the principal risks and some limited opportunities to Scotland from a changing climate. We must prepare for these changes to minimise the impacts of climate change and take advantage of the opportunities, although I would stress that where examples of positive impacts are cited, they are often rendered meaningless because of concurrent risks in other respects. The draft Climate Change Adaptation Programme sets out how we are doing this. We are working to achieve our national adaptation objectives, not only through integrating adaptation within Scottish Government policies, but through encouraging and facilitating partnership working across organisations, businesses, the public sector and individuals across Scotland. And we are building partnerships to improve our understanding of the impacts of climate change. Where we need to continue to build the evidence base, our policies need to be flexible to respond to new information as it becomes available. And that is why the programme is part of an iterative process, with subsequent programmes required every 5 years to respond to the emerging evidence base and address the risks identified in future climate change risk assessments. Despite my job title, no one minister is responsible for responding to the impacts of climate change. This is a cross-government issue, and the programme draws together work across many areas of government. In my own portfolio, flooding is an impact that can create risks across a number of sectors, and that is why reducing flood risk is one of the priorities for this programme. And we're working closely with local authorities, SEPA, Scottish Water and others to produce the first round of local flood risk plans, which will help strategically target resources at reducing flood risk across Scotland. And in conclusion, Convener, climate change is one of my top priorities, and my role in tackling it is a responsibility that I take particularly seriously. And I look forward to this morning's discussion on the actions the Scottish Government is taking to engage others and influence behaviours, the Low Carbon Scotland Behaviours Framework, as well as increasing Scotland's resilience through our Climate Change Adaptation Programme.
Thank you, Minister, for that. I think we need to ask you for what sort of parameters we're working in. We want to change behaviour, we want to adapt to climate change. What level of climate change is your policy aimed at? Is it 0.5 of a degree, or is it 4 degrees, or what?
Well, the Scottish Government, Convener, is targeting our RPP2, trying to do whatever we can domestically and obviously in collaboration with international partners to maintain contain the increases in global temperature, surface temperature increases to under 2 degrees. Or that's the objective, and the science underlying that objective has informed the targets that the Scottish Parliament unanimously adopted, and trying to deliver 42% reduction by 2020 and the minimum of an 80% reduction by 2050. So we feel those are the figures that are consistent based on scientific evidence of containing global surface temperatures to under 2 degree increase in the future.
In that case, having cleared up that overarching point, the ISM tools you've described as across departments, how far down the chain of civil service and officials is this kind of exercise taking place? Because it's obvious that communications within government and across departments is one thing at ministerial level, but how far is that actually taking place in the government's whole structure?
Clearly, I fully support the point you're making. I think that if we left the entire burden of delivering on climate change targets to either myself as one minister or indeed the relatively small team that's in the climate change team to do it, it would be an impossible task. So we have to cascade that information, cascade that responsibility throughout government, but also across different sectors in terms of local government and indeed business community. And that's why it is so positive that we have engagement from the 2020 Climate Group and also COSLA and other groups in terms of supporting our agenda. And we've now got the newly established Public Sector Climate Leaders Forum. I'm not sure, Convener, if you want to come on to that in more detail, but I know that was a concern during the RPP2 process about the governance arrangements, the ability to ensure that we deliver on our climate change targets and monitor performance. So that's a very important forum for monitoring and delivery, but it also gives us a vehicle by which we can cascade the ISM approach throughout government and indeed down through local government and business. So I'll maybe invite Helen Mansfield just to comment on it very briefly, but just to say that you know, we've already had a climate leaders workshop which involved stakeholders from local government, third sector and business, as well as Scottish Government and our agencies, to explain and explore the ISM approach for them, so they're aware of the approach and that they can take on board the messages. But I'll maybe ask Helen just to comment on how we're taking that down to officer level and beyond.
Yeah, one of the things we're doing is we're working with policy areas across government, so policy leaders on RPP2 in particular, but also in other areas, and talking about the tool, running workshops and engaging them. And so far, since the tool's been launched, we've run 4 workshops and we've got 3 further ones in the pipelines. We're also working with local government. We're going to be at the SSN conference tomorrow looking at local government officers, and we have 2 local authorities already engaged in using the tool, with 2 workshops planned with them.
Which authorities?
Murray and West Lothian. Let's just make sure I get that right. We're also working with other organisations like Sustrans and Young Scot are interested in looking at the tool again. So what we're trying to do at the moment is do a range of familiarisation workshops alongside an actual workshop on behaviour. So we're trying to get as many people involved in understanding the tool so that when the point is right for them to engage and to use the tool, they have a knowledge about using it and they can come to us and we can help them with that.
I could just add one further point, Convener. I suppose the initial workshop I described covered many issues, but one of the key issues that came forward was the need for leadership. Now obviously, I think there's a tendency to reflect on leadership being always at ministerial level or at government, Scottish Government. But the conclusion of everybody in that room was that leadership had to be demonstrated by us all, and I would cheekily suggest including everybody in the committee and indeed the Parliament taking a lead and identifying what we can all do. And I think the point that's been made is about showing that demonstrating that we can, if you like, walk the walk as well as talk the talk, and actually prove that these behaviours are being implemented at a personal level as well as an organisational level. And so business leaders, local government leaders, government ministers, politicians in general, leaders in communities can all show that leadership and demonstrate to people there are practical steps that you can take. It's not, you know, it's quite a scary task we have ahead of us in terms of, in many levels, trying to address climate change. But by using the ISM approach, we can help them understand how they can influence behaviours within their own fields of expertise, but also show leadership to ensure that that message is cascaded down.
A supplementary for Helen Mansbridge first.
Thank you, Convener. I very much welcome what the Minister's just said. But to be clear, we're talking about 2 councils leading the way at the moment. How confident are you that this approach will be rolled out across all 32 authorities and cascaded down through from the very top of those authorities? So it isn't just the hierarchy of any local authority that's taking this on board. It goes down to individual departments, individuals working in the departments, which is obviously a huge task. But what are we talking about time-wise, ballpark, to get to this position?
I think first stages for us is to see the feedback from the first 2 workshops and to see how they've been implemented and to see how we can improve that and make the tool work for local authorities. And also tomorrow with the SSN workshop and bringing a whole range of people together, once we've done a specific one on for local authority officers, we can really see how far and quickly we can drive it forward. One of the key issues for us will obviously be having the facilitators in place to help run these workshops, and that's something we're looking at and we'll be looking at as we go forward. So we're aware that this is a big task for us, and it's not something we can do overnight, but it's certainly something we're trying to target the resource we have as best we can, so at the areas that can have the most benefit. And obviously, once we have some of the case studies from workshops, we can use them with other local authorities. So there might be some benefit that we can actually, rather than rolling out individual workshops all the time, there's lessons that we can roll out as well. So we're looking at how we can do this the best way, the most efficient way with the resource we have.
Okay, thank you.
Blair Baker.
Thank you, Convener. The Minister has said that he can't deliver this on his own. It needs government activity across all departments. How do we, there's been questions raised around the Scottish Planning Policy, number 3, and also the National Framework for Planning. How do we ensure that things that are already advancing and going through the system are also playing their part in contributing towards reducing climate change, to make sure that those kind of policies are tied up, even though it's a different minister that's taking the lead on that?
I suppose it's a fair point. I would sort of highlight that I've mentioned to the committee before on a couple of occasions that a regular programme of bilateral. So in the case with the planning system, I do meet with Mr Mackay to discuss issues of common interest and try and, if you like, explore how colleagues, including Mr Mackay, but other colleagues across government, can adapt their policies to take more account of our need to deliver on climate change targets. So I have every confidence that they are aware of the issues and that there's a need to reflect in policy, whether it's capital spending decisions or indeed resource allocation on a day-to-day basis. How can we make more of the planning system in this case to deliver on climate change? So discussions with Mr Mackay have looked at areas about how can we make design of developments where you've got new developments happening, or street design or housing design, be more energy efficient, but also the layout of a master plan, can it be more energy efficient? Can we look at appropriate use of different house types, which obviously flats and terraced housing is more energy efficient, might not always be as appealing to people to buy because everybody seems to want to have a detached house, but it certainly is more energy efficient. We know that. So it's how can we have appropriate design of our settlements to make them pedestrian friendly? How can we support sustainable active travel and design to try and help behavioural change? So we're not creating the kind of estates that, frankly, I grew up in the 1980s, which was designed for cars, and it was almost impossible to get from A to B by walking without using a car or a bus. So there's a lot we can do, and I agree with you that the planning system is an important tool. So I know Mr Mackay is aware of these issues and obviously would look to interact with him in due course, but the ISM tool can equally apply to colleagues across departments like planning. So planning officials, those who are involved with informing policy, could be usefully exposed to the ISM approach and understand how they can help individuals with the social context that they're in, the material regulatory context that they're in, that will have an impact on low carbon behaviour. So I think there are various ways in which we can incorporate this kind of approach into mainstream policy, and I think you're right to raise it.
When there was, sorry, conveners, the building standards that were introduced last year didn't go as far as some were arguing they should in terms of new building regulations and standards. Where do you think is there areas where the government needs to further legislate, or where are there weaker areas where you have concerns about the ability to make progress in those areas?
Well, I'd be the first to acknowledge that there are obviously countries across Europe which have higher building standards than we do. And in an ideal world, I would like to see us get to that point where we have similar energy efficiency standards to places like Germany, Sweden, and other countries where they have taken that approach. We are working through planning colleagues with the house building sector to try and see what more we can do. We've had some concerns raised by the house building sector about the marginal returns, if you like, to investment in energy efficiency measures in new build, and whether there should be a balance putting more investment into retrofit of existing stock, where they think there'd be more impact. And there's some valid points in there about, we know that insulation of properties is a very efficient and cost-effective way of reducing climate emissions. So we need to do more of that, and there's plenty of stock, as I'm sure Claire Baker knows, around Scotland where solid wall construction, older properties in rural areas that we have not even touched. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there too, with existing stock as well as the new build properties. I would point out that the new builds that are being built in Scotland under the new arrangements will continue to be the most energy efficient ones across the UK in terms of having the highest standards of building regulation. But I am aware, and I'm sure Claire Baker is from her question, of voices from outside saying we should be doing more. And obviously I will explore with colleagues where we can push that boundary a little bit further. And I think in the longer term, because it creates a level playing field, all house builders are affected equally by it. It's not anti-competitive in that sense. Everyone's affected equally. So it's an area that we'll look to explore how we can work with the house building sector to increase the rate at which we adopt these technologies.
This is proving a popular question. Jamie McGregor.
Thank you. Will the advice that government gives to councils include the inadvisability of building houses on floodplains?
Well, I'll maybe ask Neil Ritchie to come in on the detail of this.
At the point when we get to flooding, because you can certainly come back with that question then.
Okay.
If you don't
I'm in
mind.
your hands, Convener.
Well, it's related to planning, but also planning was related to the ISM tool. If we can keep it in order, you'll get a chance to come in. There's a section on flooding later on, if you don't mind. Thanks. I want to ask you, Minister, just finally on this section, so as we can get into other people's questions. If you think that there's a need to measure the effectiveness of the ISM tool, I recall, what do you think about something even more important than investors and people, which was all the rage about 20 years ago? Is there a sense that we should be ensuring that people in all sectors of public life and in business sign up to this approach?
I think it's a good point. I mean, I'm hoping we get to the position where people just accept that there's kind of a new way of thinking, and it's actually a smart way of thinking, and it's a sign of, if you like, a good strategy that people are thinking about the context in which they're planning their policies. So I hope almost by osmosis and by word of mouth that this becomes the kind of norm. But there may be an argument for recognising that in some way, but perhaps more user-friendly way than using ISM in terms of the badging, that policymakers and businesses indeed and other stakeholders are actually thinking about the individuals that they're regulating for or legislating for, in many cases, about the context in which it's happening. So it's, if you like, it's user-centred, it's person-centred kind of policy making, understanding the context in which we're asking people to implement behaviour change. But maybe, I don't know whether that's something that's come up in the workshops, and we raise that with Helen.
Well, one of the things we are looking at as well, we're looking at working with the 2020 group, who deal with a lot of businesses, so we've got some work going on with them coming up shortly. We're also looking to work with the Climate Challenge Fund to look at how this could benefit community groups. Now, at the moment, the tool's been very much written for a policy maker, because it was for us to help us with our behavioural policies. But we see that the benefit is much wider than just government. And at the moment, we're now trying to see how we can deliver on that. So working with the 2020 group and with Climate Challenge Fund groups, we're really going to see how we can develop the tool and how we can use it. So at the moment, we've issued the user guide that anyone can pick up and use. But I think as we develop and as we move forward, we will look at how we work with community groups on this more and how we work with businesses. So it will certainly become more ingrained.
It's an ism that we can all sign up to. Next question, Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Can I keep on the point of key behaviour change areas? I know the Scottish Government has previously set out areas of high household emissions where action by government and others could be taken to encourage or enable behaviour change. These 10 key behaviour change areas cover home energy, transport, food and consumption. Last month, the Scottish Government published a report on the uptake of the key 10 carbon behaviour areas. Given that the low carbon behaviour framework does not establish specific targets for each of the 10 behaviour areas, I'd be interested to know how the Government assesses whether the level of progress in each area is on track or not, since we have not, regrettably, met some of the targets that we've set down for ourselves in the last couple of years.
Well, it's an important point. I mean, clearly we have the 10 green behaviours, and I've got examples here if you need them in terms of the ones we are focusing on. And you know, clearly it's backed by campaigns like Greener Together campaign, and particular subsections of that. One's dealing with food waste, one's dealing with sustainable active travel, and we've got monitoring information about the impact of that on individuals who've seen the campaign and what it's helped with their behaviour. Now, there will be, in the advertising campaign, there'll be a kind of a rise, if you like, in awareness, and there'll probably be a peak level of compliance with the behaviours we're asking people to fulfil, and then it will fall back a bit as time goes on. So that's why we keep needing to repeat these kind of messages and get them ingrained in the heads of our fellow citizens. And in the longer term, we would hope that each time we have a campaign like that, the plateau they return to is higher than the previous one. So there's always a kind of residual, if you like, benefit from having such a campaign, and that locks in that good behaviour and encourages them to keep going. Clearly, we have a number of targets which are set out in the, or at least the latest figures that are set out in the low carbon behaviours framework, and in terms of the indicators, and they do feed into the national performance framework as well. So many of them are relevant for that. Our overall targets in terms of reducing emissions, our carbon footprint, percentage of people agreeing that climate change is an immediate and urgent problem hasn't been tested since 2008. But that's that's one that's obviously a key figure. And back then it was 57% of people who recognised that. But we will continue to monitor where we can through survey evidence, what's happening in terms of some of the key behaviours, like in home energy efficiency. We've got sort of physical statistics about how many houses have been converted, so we know how many houses are brought up to a higher standard in terms of insulation. So we know what proportion of them have, sort of up to 100 millimetres insulation, how many have got more than that. And so we can monitor those kind of objective measures over time and make some assumptions about behavioural change. But, as I pointed out earlier on, we also have to inform people that of the implications. So if someone's got a more energy efficient house and they don't and that saves them money, they don't then take that saving and say, well, okay, we can afford to have the house warmer, so we'll put the thermostat up a bit further and heat the house even more. So you end up with the same amount of emissions, but just with a warmer house. So there's a lot of work has to be done to inform people about the continued need for bearing down on emissions. So indeed, if you've got a fuel efficient car, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do myself in terms of my own behaviour, is trying to drive in a more ecologically sensitive way, fuel efficient way, and I've had some good progress. I'll not put any formal figures out there, but I'm happy with my own performance there. But I mean, it would be perverse if I suddenly used that then to raise the amount of mileage I drove to use that extra fuel that I've saved to go further, because then you're just cancelling out the benefit that you've delivered. So we've got a lot of work to do, and if you like, the question you've raised underpins the importance of having this continued programme of social research and advertising and marketing campaigns to ensure we continue to monitor the impact on individuals, but also continue to invest in giving those messages out so we can lock in that good behaviour and make sure, as I say, each time the plateau is higher and we're getting towards the position where we have those behaviours locked in.
I totally agree with the comments you made. In fact, I think several months ago in a question I asked, and you said lead by example, we found that the Scottish Parliament, the building, actually the energy consumption had reduced over the last year. The very point I'm always on about is that a lot of people walk out of a room and forget to switch off the light. And lastly, in regards to the point you're making about councils, it astounded me to find that Glasgow City Council actually consumes 3 million, on a question I asked some time ago, 3 million litres of fuel every year. And I also am trying to reduce my and increase my mileage in my car, and I compliment you on the way that you're trying to do that too. And if everyone would follow that example, we would all contribute to reducing climate change. Thank you.
Well, can I just praise Richard Lyle for doing that? And I think the more that we talk about these issues and showing what, in your case, Mr. Lyle's doing that and driving in a more fuel-efficient way, and just circulating, and I'm sure that's true of everybody around the table. We're all doing our own bit, but just make sure people know about it. Show leadership. Make sure the good things you're doing are publicised, and that you are taking a leadership role and communicating that to the people that listen to you and are influenced by you, and they will pick up on that message and think, well, if they can do it, I can do it.
I think we'll have a bring and tell session at another point.
It's a great idea.
Claudia Beamish.
I'm not telling at the moment.
Sorry.
Sorry, Convener, were you wanting me to come in on...
Yeah, next question. Clear, is it?
Yeah, I did have a quick supplementary, if I may. I was going
it's
to
both
indicate.
CB, of course, you see,
Yes.
so Claire Baker.
Is it all right for me to have a quick supplementary?
Oh, yes,
on the last
certainly.
one? Thank
As
you.
long as they're not bringing and telling.
Sorry. Apologies, Claire. Just to ask specifically, good morning, Minister, about farming and farming for a better climate and concerns of farmers, and the following really on from Dick Lyle's questions about whether there are targets and assessments for behaviour change. It's obviously quite daunting for farmers like any businesses, but just wondering if you can comment on how that's going.
Well, certainly. I mean, first thing to say is that as the figures set out around the time RP2 was published indicate that agriculture has actually made one of the biggest steps forward in terms of its emissions of any sectors. So there's already been excellent progress, and I can fish out the figures for the committee if you like, but it was above the average increase, decrease in emissions. So agriculture is already doing a lot of good work, and it's about making sure that we communicate that positive story to farmers to say, I think the term we've used at the Climate Leaders Workshop was about practical hope, that people, it's quite a daunting challenge we have as a society. And actually, there's an element, there could be a tendency, if we're very doom and gloom and very apocalyptic about this, that people switch off and think, well, there's no point in doing anything because we're doomed, there's nothing we can do. But we can deliver on this, where the agriculture sector is already doing great things. Obviously, we've got targets in terms of RPP2 to try and address issues like use of nitrogen, try and continue to bear down on the use of nitrogen in farming where possible. And clearly there are, through Farming for a Better Climate, demonstrator farms, and I've been to see Robert Nisbet's farm, and Robert McNeil's farm in Upper Nisbet in the Borders, growing clover on the farm to provide feed for his own cattle, but also reducing his use of nitrogen because of the particular properties of that crop. So there are many things we can do. We just need to get dissemination through the very important networks that we have with the Farming for a Better Climate network to say, rather than politicians telling farmers what to do, they'll listen to people that are in their own sector, their peers, people they respect because they're good farmers, and say, these are things that Farmer X is doing in his farm. It's a livestock farm, or her farm is an arable farm, and they are demonstrating this, and they're more than willing to have people in to show them what they are doing, and through SRUC and other partners communicate what's actually happening at a farm level. I know there is an ISM workshop which is due to happen reasonably soon with sorry, was it?
It's shortly, actually.
Shortly, yeah. With the farming community to try and look at the behavioural aspects of farming, because there's a number of drivers there in terms of what's technically possible, but also there may be financial drivers. It's about making farms more resilient for the future. They can save themselves a lot of money if they are producing their own feed, because of feed costs are quite volatile, fertiliser costs are volatile. So the more that they can do to be self-sufficient in terms of feed and producing naturally the nutrients for their soil, they can save themselves a lot of money and be more financially resilient in the future.
So could I quickly ask you, Minister, do you...
Land and environment very soon.
Which is my question, so I'll wait.
Yes, good. CB, I'm on the wavelength. Claire Baker.
To go back to the 10 behaviour areas, some of the evidence the committee received talked about they didn't feel there's enough join up between the 10 areas, that people could select one or two, or they might focus on one area, and actually what it needs is a more holistic approach, and for the individual to be more engaged in all the areas. How do you think that we can achieve that? And also, what have you identified as being the main drivers to make people change their behaviour? Because you mentioned the Not Far Leave the Car campaign. How are you measuring how successful those campaigns are? Because part of it maybe seems that people who respond to that are people who are already thinking in that way, and that's given them a message that already enforces what they're heading towards. How do you, have you identified as being the main drivers for the individual? And do we have the right, is it cost that actually drives, or is it a feeling that it's responsibility towards the environment, or is it, what are the key areas? That...
I think it's multifactorial, to be honest. There will be specific issues. People will maybe do it through altruism. They'll want to do it because they want to help the environment. They want to help address climate change directly. There will be, people are complex individuals, and they may have multiple drivers in individual cases. So they may be driven by financial imperative. If you're walking, you're obviously saving yourself even the cost of a bus fare. But certainly, if you're not driving, you're saving yourself at the point you're taking a journey under 3 miles. The energy used in driving a car in a journey of that length is disproportionate, because the engine is less efficient at that point in the journey. It's longer journeys, the engine is usually more fuel efficient over a longer distance. So the engine's warming up, physically warming up, it's less efficient. So if we can avoid those kind of journeys, then clearly it's going to have a financial benefit for the individual as well. But there are also health benefits. Walking is a good exercise, a good form of exercise, which most people can do. And therefore it's an easy way of burning calories, making people more healthy. So there will be a number of different influences, and you're absolutely right that it's not a silver bullet in each case that you could say this is one message that will switch everybody over to that positive behaviour. We have to, and this is why ISM is so important, you need to understand the individual tastes, drivers, factors influencing individuals' behaviours, and that's different subsections of the community as well as individuals. So you can group people into categories in some respects. That can be helpful, but at the same time you also have to understand we're all individuals, we all have different balances in terms of our motivation, and so the more we understand about that, the more we can target our policies effectively. In terms of the efficacy of those kind of campaigns, I mean, if it's just useful for one example, in the active travel campaign, we know that independent research showed that 45% of people who'd seen the campaign felt motivated to change their behaviour in relation to active travel, and 19% of those who saw the campaign claimed to have done something as a result. So there's an element of raising awareness, which is a higher group of people, and then within that there was 19% of all those who saw the adverts actually did change their behaviour as a result of the campaign. And of those that visited the field marketing stand that we've had at various events, 89% claimed they'd left their car for short journeys as a result of the visit. So there's some encouraging results. I'm not saying it's perfect, and clearly we are aware that with any advertising campaign, whether it's for industry or for issues like this, as I said to Mr Lyle, there will be a fall-off as time goes by, and you need to keep reiterating the message and hammering it home so that people do get it over a period of time, and hope that you take that level of awareness up to a point where they lock in that behaviour eventually and just think, that is me, that is what I do, rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to do this because it's in the news. So it just becomes natural and a kind of instinctive reaction to just do the things we want them to do.
We've talked quite a bit this morning about car usage as being kind of one of the key areas. Other areas around behaviour changes is around fuel and fuel use within the home, indeed, and installation and all those type of areas. Earlier when we talked about house building, do you think there needs to be a bigger debate around what people value and where? Because one of the issues why the building sector didn't support greater regulation was about rising costs. But if somebody was going to purchase a house where they thought their fuel bills would be lower, there's a need to kind of tie up all these different areas when it comes to the individual understanding what impact these kind of decisions can have.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, and indeed, obviously we've got the energy performance certificates in the new home buyers packs, which is one kind of way of trying to influence people's thinking in that direction, so they are looking at the longer term, not just the immediate upfront cost, but the value to them of that technology. I do think we probably, and I'd welcome the committee's view on this, if you're taking evidence from a number of stakeholders, about how we try and work with house builders, for example, as just one example, but there are other product areas, obviously, that are just as relevant, where we can try and get them to market that kind of information to potential house buyers. Because the point I've made in many discussions has been, most people these days when they're buying a new house are buying off plan. The house isn't even built yet, and so you've got the opportunity to influence the actual specification of the house at that point when you're buying it. Now, if the house builders are able to put the options to people and say, there's kind of very much a black and white world at the moment. They're saying, well, we're not going to do that because we don't think people will buy it and not pay the extra value for the cost that we're having to put in. And that may well be true, but we've got to test it as well. We've got to sort of see to what extent people might be willing. If they've got the option in front of them that you spend an extra 3,000 or 4,000, perhaps it might save you, 10,000 over the lifetime that you're going to have the house, and they've got the funds at that time, they might be willing to invest. And so let's explore that and see how we can give that kind of long-term life cycle cost information to people so they can make those kind of informed decisions. Because clearly when you've got solar, the marketing of solar energy products to households, that very much is the argument that's made. You can get a 12% rate of return or whatever it is on a solar panel, and that seems to influence people to think, oh, actually that's quite a sensible investment, and it changes their mindset. So I certainly would welcome the committee's view if there's any evidence you've taken to date on how we might be able to do that.
Well, there's just a point about this question which is key, which is that the behaviour areas shouldn't be seen in isolation, because like recycling was one isolated example. So what's the government going to do to present it as a whole lifestyle change?
Well, I think you're right, Convener. This is, I suppose, one of the things that we need to do in terms of using ISM across government. It will help people, and particularly in the context of low carbon behaviours, it will help people understand how all policy areas have a relevance to this agenda, either in terms of the delivery of services and the messages for those who are delivering services, but also thinking about the benefits to individuals and communities as well. So there is very much a life cycle, a lifestyle issue here, and we are, without being too doom and gloom, we're going to have to face the reality that life will not be quite the same. Hopefully we can improve people's quality of life in many areas, but we also have to accept that we have to make some difficult decisions, and so therefore at an individual level, at a community level, at a business level and government level, clearly we have to take these decisions on the chin and to inform individuals about the kind of choices they face.
Thanks. Public sector engagement question from Angus MacDonald.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Well, clearly the public sector engagement has already been touched on this morning, and I'm certainly pleased to hear that public sector forums and workshops are underway. And I think Helen Mansbridge mentioned that there's been 4 workshops so far, and that you've got the SSN workshop tomorrow. So, I'm also very pleased to hear that Murray and West Lothian councils have embraced the ISM approach, and they certainly have to be commended for that. And I'll certainly be going back to my local authority in Falkirk to encourage them to follow the Murray and West Lothian example. Now, there was strong support from oral evidence that the committee took towards the role the public sector plays in delivering low-carbon behaviour change. And there was also a clear acknowledgement of the need for innovation, and I hope that COSLA, the Scottish Government and public bodies can work together on behaviour change. So can I ask, Minister, what steps the Government's taking to support public sector bodies in their role to help support practical action on low-carbon behaviours?
Well, I think it gets to number. I think Helen has already touched on some of this earlier on. I think we obviously have got some work that's been done with the 2 local authorities, Murray and West Lothian, but that's not to say that there aren't good examples of things that are happening elsewhere. Whether it's, you know, I think I've mentioned to committee before, I'm impressed with some work that's been done in Aberdeenshire, for example, where you've got local centres where people are able to work locally rather than travelling into a corporate headquarters. I mean, there has been I suppose, if you like, a trend in recent decades. It's about, to a certain degree, centralisation of local government services in kind of corporate headquarters functions, and certainly in my own area in the Borders, I'm sure Mr Hume will be aware there's been a kind of a retraction from the old district council delivery centres to the central hub in Newton St Boswell. So that's kind of what's happening in Aberdeenshire is quite a positive thing from the point of view of reducing car miles and emissions related to transport for workers getting to their administrative centre. That's a very positive example, and we need to find more of these and make sure that, if you like, there's a suite of things which are being done across the public sector. People say, oh, hang on, I didn't realise that was happening there, that looks interesting, relevant for us, and we can maybe copy that. It might not be appropriate in every location, and I think that's where the ISM tool is also appropriate for local government, because we have to take into account, when we're discussing what behavioural changes can be affected, the context in which they are being done. So we need to understand a solution that might work in Edinburgh might not work in the Western Isles because of the different topography and cultural issues there. So we have to be sensitive to where we're doing it, and clearly support local government with and other public sector partners through training for ISM and rollout of kind of practical examples and information, good practice points that they can pick up on. But I'm not sure if either Bob or Helen want to comment further about the convener, if that's appropriate. Bob, do you want to say anything about it?
Certainly, Minister. Thank you. I mean, I might just point out that ISM, which we actually hope will be adopted and used widely, is not actually an end in itself. It only operates through the development of policies, be they in the housing sector, be they in transport, be they within local authorities or other public bodies themselves. And what we are keen for is that the owners of these policies, both in central government and in local government, actually have a look at this as a way of looking at how they can make their policy implementation better, be it about reducing mileages in fleets, be it about better energy efficiency and usage in homes, be it about food waste or whatever. Does it have a contribution? Is this a better way of thinking about how to get these behaviour changes through our delivery organisations? And that, I think, is what our activity that Helen has been describing is about, is offering this as a possibility to do policy work better, not because the government actually says it's a good thing, but because it's actually meaningful to how you need to engage with the various constituencies that they actually have. And there are significant activities in the behavioural change already actually happening. I mean, and they should actually continue. Perhaps they can be reinforced by this, but it's not presented as a substitute for that. And we want to encourage and identify as much of these good examples as we can through the support networks that the Minister has said, particularly the newly established Public Sector Leaders Forum, so that that can actually demonstrate good examples and bring together some of that join-up between policy areas that I think that many of the committee members have expressed concern about how best to do that. And that is the process of engagement that we're actually trying to do with COSLA, with local authorities and with the various public bodies that we have contact with regularly.
Can I mention one just practical area? I appreciate time's passing, but just to say that clearly one other area that government can help local government in this context is through resourcing, and I appreciate there's always calls on government for more resource, but we are deploying some additional funding in relation to areas like sustainable active travel through Climate Challenge Fund and other vehicles, which, and while in the case of Climate Challenge Fund, communities are the lead here, so it's demand-led and it's communities that apply for the funding. We are helping through the Ideas Bank local government to understand how they can maybe feed ideas in for communities then to pick up on, so they can pose, I feel like, a challenge or an idea that might be something that fits with their own delivery of policy in relation to climate change, and then local communities can say, hang on, actually we'd quite fancy having involvement in a project like that, and we will explore Climate Challenge Fund as a way of funding that at a local level. So we're aware, obviously, there is the material element, the regulatory and funding environment in which our public sector partners work, and we're very sensitive to that as well.
And on this point, Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. I guess my question is about the decisions that are taken for financial reasons, perhaps by local authorities. I mean, like the Scottish Government, local authorities have difficult budget decisions to make. How do we ensure that finance conveners and councils aren't making spending decisions purely as black and white, save money here, save money there, at the expense of the climate?
Well, I mean, there's two aspects to this. I suppose one, the local authorities through the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 are signed up to the climate change public duty, so they report annually, voluntarily, I might add, on the climate change duty and their performance in that respect. So there's a kind of a reputational element. Obviously, local authorities are trying to deliver on their, just in the same way as government's got to deliver on its targets, the local government sector is signed up to help us with that, and we certainly welcome their support. But in terms of the actual decision-making process, I think we have to, we've got a role, I suppose, to make sure that decision makers in finance functions have all the information at their disposal, so they know, they can understand, if you like, the climate change impact of their decisions and reflect on that when they are, as a key consideration when they are determining their investment. We can obviously give a bit of a lead at government level in our own spending priorities. We're obviously signalling that we're increasing the share of our budget each year which is going into low carbon. It's a key part of the government economic strategy, is for the refresh of that, which took place in 2011, included low carbon economy as a key target, so developing that. So that's now enshrined at a national level, that then feeds through into single outcome agreements and so forth. So local government should, in theory, and all public sector agencies should, through their public duty on climate change, be taking these matters into account. But I appreciate there's a role in making sure they've got information to understand what the efficacy is, if you like, of each type of investment project in delivering on climate change. And if there are specific recommendations you feel the committee want to make in terms of how we can make that information available, I'll certainly look at them carefully. But we've tried in our own budget, through the carbon assessment of the Scottish Government's budget, to demonstrate how our spending decisions impact on climate change, and hopefully that will help inform that process too.
If I may, though, Minister, of course the government has a role in doing that, but equally we need local authorities and other public bodies to have the mindset that they have a responsibility to do that. In your experience, how confident are you that that mindset is either there or it is developing?
I am confident. I think it's developing. Would I want it to happen more quickly? And I think this is true of all public sector. Then yes, we've had studies done by Carbon Trust and others which look at how the public sector can contribute to our climate emission targets, and that's very helpful in informing discussion. And but I know there's a lot of good work going out there. I think it's sharing that practice, making sure, as Bob's saying, that we give as many examples out so that people are aware of the positive things that are happening, and that almost is a bit of peer pressure. They say, well, if that council is doing it, we better do it too. Yeah. So that will help. But I am confident. I think Councillor Stephen Hagan, I've got a good relationship with him. I think he's very much a supporter of this agenda and trying to ensure that we engage positively. We've got the SSN conference tomorrow, and I'll get a better feel as to where we're at in terms of the views of those at the conference tomorrow. But I am confident we're getting there. I think there's always scope for improvement, clearly, and I'm hoping that through the Public Sector Climate Leaders Forum and the fact we've got this enhanced network of climate champions that effectively will sit under that we will want to cascade the messages from the Climate Leaders Forum through the public sector, both local government, health, other areas, our own agencies and government clearly as well, that we will achieve that result.
Okay, thank you.
A quick follow-up on the use of the media, Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I'm sure most of us around this table have experienced that it's not always possible for us to get the media to take the line that we want them to take, some more than others perhaps. Well, indeed, that view was heard in evidence from a number of witnesses that we've heard to date, that there are particular challenges with working with the media on this agenda, and you've already touched on marketing, Minister. However, can you advise the committee on how the government approaches working with the media to support action on low carbon behaviour, and can you point to any more specific examples on where the Scottish Government has or plans to use media and marketing to promote low carbon behaviour change?
Well, indeed, you are right to identify that the media has a hugely important role to play. We have, there'll be various estimates, but broadly speaking, about half of what we need to achieve as a society in terms of climate change might in some way be dependent on behavioural change. At one level, it's behavioural change 100%, because obviously we need to make capital investment, and there's individuals changing their behaviour in terms of policy there as well. But I'm talking about sort of individuals, communities, businesses. About half of what we have to do is through that route. So we've got a hugely important role there for media in helping us communicate messages. Now there is, as you quite rightly kind of indicate or shall we say imply, some degree of climate denial and climate scepticism within the media, and even people I know in climate science community would say that a degree of scepticism in any area of science is healthy, because that sort of challenges, and you then have an opportunity to demonstrate that you're hopefully correct. But there are people that are climate deniers as well, that even despite the evidence in front of them continue to deny that climate change is happening, and indeed that humans are largely responsible for it. The IPCC report, I think, should dispel any notion that that the climate change is a false concept, because it's clearly demonstrated that climate change is happening, and the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report also makes very clear that mankind is responsible for the majority of what is happening. So there should no longer be any doubt, I think, that this is a hugely significant problem that society faces, and we need to challenge it. As to things we are doing in terms of the media, we have had previously a campaign through STV, the Too Good to Waste series, which was shown in April 2012, and audience figures and independent evaluation of the programme showed this was a very, very effective approach to reach a particular audience and deliver behavioural change. And we plan to take forward a similar approach again and have another programme now. Jim Hume will know, and indeed Claudia Beamish will know, that STV is not broadcast in the south of Scotland, and that's a continuing issue, but we will try and use radio and other means to get a similar message out there. And in the longer term, obviously, I know I'm certainly exploring with colleagues whether there's any opportunities to get ITV Border to pick up the programme and broadcast it as well, certainly to the Cumbrian and Scottish part of their catchment, which I believe the signal now can be split. So But we have used television as an effective tool. We can use radio. Some of the campaigns we use are on the other forms of broadcast media, like local radio, as we know is very effective at delivering these kind of messages. So you will, in driving around your constituencies, listening to commercial radio and local radio, you may well hear the kind of messages that are coming out there, and that is effective too. But we do have a bit of a challenge, I think, with the print media, which is perhaps a tendency to sell papers obviously goes for maybe a more sensationalist approach, and sometimes can be unhelpful and unconstructive in terms of its approach to it. So I would certainly appeal to our colleagues and friends in the print media to take this matter seriously and to communicate the messages in a responsible way and make sure that we get that message across.
Appropriate that we move on to managing uncertainty next then. Graham Day.
Thank you. As we've been discussing this morning, we obviously need buy-in to this process from all sectors of society, and that being the case in looking at the private sector perhaps and individuals and communities. In what ways, Minister, do you feel the draft programme might be strengthened to ensure that advice and information is readily available for those who need to be better informed before making changes and adaptations to their businesses and their ways of life? And in what ways are individuals and local communities going to be supported to ensure they're actively engaged in delivering the draft programme's objectives?
Well, clearly the communication of the programme, through the consultation, you know, we're obviously going to take representations from various interest groups about what we can do in this respect. But you know, there are different audiences we're pitching to. Clearly, there are messages of adaptation that are very relevant to the individual in terms of understanding the changes which may affect them. As we've discussed before previously in relation to flood risk, it's important that we communicate to people the responsibility they have for the property under the current legislative framework, that people are responsible for protecting their own property, whether that's a business property or domestic property. And so you know, we need to communicate that, but also make them aware that there are steps they can take. And across Scotland, we've got a growing network of local flood groups which are helping communities to tackle such challenges and make sure they have a sort of cost-effective way equipment that's available to them to protect the property. So it's about making sure there's sufficient information now through organisations like Scottish Flood Forum. In that case, we can help communities at that level. And we are taking forward as well a modification to Climate Challenge Fund to enable community-level adaptation projects, which will help communities both to deliver adaptation approaches, but also to communicate the importance of it to community level too. And we've had some pilot work done in Loch Boysdale, for example, in the Western Isles, and we can learn from that and finesse the approach so that we learn what worked well and what didn't work well in that case. The 5 priority areas that we are working on in the Adaptation Scotland approach is support for the public sector, including the kind of adaptation tools to support public bodies in adapting to climate change. Then we, as I say, we support climate-ready communities through direct engagement, as I've discussed, raising awareness of opportunities and challenges they face. We've got adaptation support for business, which is being delivered or addressed through the high-level support through the 2020 Climate Group, and engaging business in forming partnership working, encouraging widest uptake of adaptation planning support among the business community. And I think it's an issue just to highlight that there is a concern that many businesses are very much thinking about the short term and not looking long enough ahead and planning for, and whether it's adaptation appears within their corporate strategy as a risk, it should be seen in many sectors as a quite distinct and identifiable commercial risk to them, whether it's to their supply chain or to them directly, and they should be factoring it into their strategy. We can look at place-based adaptation approaches as well, and we've got initiatives, local initiatives like Climate Ready Clyde, which brings together public bodies, community groups, private organisations to identify threats and opportunities facing their particular region. And then we've got providing the support on climate and information adaptation science and tools to underpin all of that. But I think you're right, there's still a dimension at the individual level as well, which we can communicate through community routes and businesses.
If I may, Convener, following on from that and beyond simply highlighting the advice and information, what role do you feel, Minister, there might be for the education, the school education system in this? You know, as a constituency member, I was recently grilled for an hour by a group of primary pupils on the subject of the environment and climate change. Their passion and their knowledge was unbelievable. Given that, I wonder, are we going to use the schools network to raise awareness and encourage that build-up of public pressure on organisations to change their behaviour?
Well, in short, I mean, yes. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, there's an element of, and I get it. I'm sure anybody who's got children will get it as well. Pester power, that it's effective for parents, grandparents, and others. You know, we do have, fortunately, in Scotland, a good network in place. We've got the Eco Schools network, and you know, Scotland is seen as a kind of relatively kind of world-leading kind of area in terms of development Eco Schools movement. We've got 4,000 schools participating in that programme already, and so that's 98% of local authority schools. So that's a good starting point, and we are doing work in terms of looking at how we can take adaptation messages to schools. Just looking for the specific example in terms of, I know we've got currently a programme of taking adaptation into schools to basically do kind of workshops, if you like, to teach secondary school. I think it's secondary school pupils in our case. We'll just check what Helen means, please, Convener.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I think we've got some work that's been done to get, I suppose, school children to recognise the risk to them in their community, to think about the consequences, to, in some ways, because issues like flooding, for example, can be quite a terrifying thing for children, and we know that from previous flood incidents it's had quite a profound impact on children in the community who sometimes struggle to understand why it's happening, and obviously they can't, perhaps in their own heads, rationalise the kind of risk issue, you know, so that, and the likelihood of it happening. So there's a lot of work done, I think, to educate young people as to where there is a community that's at risk of flooding, what that flood risk might be, the steps they can take to protect themselves, understand that, you know, it's something that can be managed, to give them confidence it can be managed, and what steps they can take. So there's a lot of work needs to be done, I think, and but we are beginning to kind of explore these areas and how we kind of tailor the message to a particular audience and make sure it's done with great sensitivity, obviously, with that particular client group.
Okay, thank you.
So I maybe missed it.
Talking about adaptation, we need to engage with local communities and so on. I wonder if you've got any formal plans to actually get to the level of dealing with local communities at a community council level without necessarily, you know, fingering the community council as such. You know, we'd like to know about these if we can.
There are some really excellent issues. I know there's a grouping of local authorities that are now working together. I know the area I live in is one of them, Scottish Borders, but there are a number of local authorities that are gathering together, kind of network, if you like, where they're sharing expertise. And I think the kind of approaches that can be deployed is developing local community resilience planning. So working with local community councils to not just deal with the kind of obvious things like flood risk, but also severe weather impacts. Doing many of the things that we probably did as a society 20, 30 years ago before we became kind of more nuclear families and more you know, sort of car dependent and less connected as local communities, getting people to acquaint themselves with how many vulnerable people there are in their community, speak to those people in advance of any kind of severe weather or indeed flood risk, to say, well, you know, in the event something happens, you know, would you like someone to chat at your door, see if you're okay, see if you need help, and just sort of, if you like, have a kind of a management of the kind of the vulnerabilities within the local community, get people to coordinate activity to clear streets of snow, make sure schools are open and accessible. And I know there are a number of authorities do this, but, you know, I think it's, you know, there's examples of good practice where perhaps local authorities have, you know, teachers that might live in one village but teach in another. They stay in the village they live in and help open up that school, whereas there might be teachers in the other community that go to the school they would have been travelling to, and keep that one open. And if we can keep our schools open, that means that because of the gender imbalance in terms of caring activities, that, you know, many women who are working in the public sector, maybe in hospitals and other vital facilities, are then able to go to work, and that keeps the whole system going. So there's a real, you know, for something as simple as just keeping the schools open, can have quite a profound impact on the resilience of a local community during either a severe weather event or flooding incident. So we, you know, there's a lot of work can be done by local authorities proactively to work with their communities and manage the local risks and plan for them.
Well, in that case, we want to continue this look at adaptation programme monitoring and assessment with Jim Hume.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Minister, of course. In our evidence sessions, there was some concern regarding the monitoring and assessment of the draft adaptation programme, particularly from Scottish Environment Link, who thought the draft programme was perhaps vague in some parts and needed more on including objectives and outcomes. David Thompson of the UK Committee on Climate Change, he also thought more work was needed to be done on monitoring and evaluating, as did Professor Rowan of the University of Dundee, a much stronger focus on the importance of targets, whether they be aspirational or fixed. Therefore, if we're going to meet our aims of the policies in the government draft programme, just wonder what the Minister would be able to do to include more clearly defined objectives, outcomes and timescales to meet these concerns.
Well, clearly, I certainly recognise the importance of the issues that Jim Hume has raised. Clearly, we have the first adaptation programme. It will evolve, I think, over time. We wouldn't want it to be a static document that that isn't reflected on, improved as time goes on. We've got the governance arrangements with the Climate Change Delivery Board, and will ensure that there's ongoing kind of scrutiny of our progress in delivering the adaptation programme. But it'd be fair to say that we have to develop, I suppose, in terms of good monitoring as we go forward, the measurement of adaptation. And that does pose some challenges, the uncertainty in respect of uncertainty of the outcomes, the imperfect state at the moment of our knowledge in some respects of what's on the ground, and long time scales involved as well in terms of some of the initiatives that need to be taken in terms of obviously some of the investment in capital, which is going to take quite some time to deliver. So it's crucial to develop the indicators over time that are effective in measuring progress against the aim and objectives set out in the programme. So I appreciate that at the moment it may, for some stakeholders, seem a bit high level, but as time we will obviously finesse our understanding of the effectiveness programme. We'll undertake evaluation of the programme as we go on. It will be an ongoing process to ensure the right measures are in place to address the effects of climate change. And in terms of, there are some things I can say about annual reporting. Work is underway to develop arrangements for annual reporting and monitoring of the programme. And alongside the annual report will be work of the Climate Exchange as well. I'm sure Jim Hume's familiar with the organisation who, through developing indicators to monitor climate change adaptation in Scotland, will focus on the risks and opportunities contained in the climate change risk assessment for Scotland, and prioritise for the first programme, monitor changing levels of risk and opportunity and their felt impacts. And they will also monitor on-the-ground adaptation and seek to understand trends in action in the context of the adaptation policies set out in the programme and other important drivers of change. So it's something that will hopefully, as the programme itself becomes more sophisticated, we'll get more sophisticated in monitoring and evaluating it, and our understanding will build as well. But I do recognise the concern to make sure we do follow this up and make sure it's being delivered and monitor its progress.
That's good. It sounds like it's going to be strengthened and monitored and assessed. And you mentioned annual reporting. Would part of that be actually yourself reporting annually to the Scottish Parliament itself?
Well, I mean, I think it's a key part of our climate change strategy, adaptation programme. I would expect a degree of pressure and scrutiny, and obviously very well mannered and fairly delivered by Mr Hume. But I'm more than happy to come to the committee and discuss this in due course if that would be of help to you.
Okay. Before you move on to the next question, there's two supplementaries. Very quickly, please. Nigel Don and then Claudia Beamish.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Minister. Morning. I'm wondering if I could just pick up on the issue that was previously mentioned, because we've got to targets and reporting. The previous exchange about how efficiently we can drive our cars, the point, and I do my level best to get to 49 miles per gallon, I'm not going to argue about the numbers. But the point is that, and it's an old adage from industry, what gets measured gets done. It's not terribly grammatical, but you know what I mean. Now, when we're trying to drive our cars efficiently, that MPG average changes, I think, about every 10 seconds. We get immediate feedback and meaningful and actually quite accurate. you've just spoken about annual reports. Now, I'm not trying to be disparaging because that's the nature of the information that you will have reporting. But when I contrast those two, then it's self-evident that it's extremely difficult for us as a society to change very much if we've got an annual report, which is quite significantly after the event as well. Could I therefore encourage you as a minister just to think about what we can possibly do at whatever level to report useful information more or less in real time in such a way that we as a society can see what we're doing? And if I might just make a suggestion, Convener, I mean, how would it be if my local authority reported the amount that was recycled from my local recycling point last week? Because somebody somewhere has got that number, crudely, and that would enable us as a society to get some idea of how good we are, perhaps, at recycling.
Well, I certainly recognise, Convener, and Mr Don, that it makes a very good point that the timeliness of information is very important. I think we discussed at committee before. I mean, some of the frustrations there are about how long we have to wait because of the nature of the rigour that has to be applied to some of the data sources for I think it was actually Mr Day raised the point, I think previously, was it not, in terms of climate change, emission statistics and other figures which we rely on to guide policy, but which inherently are well behind. I'm expecting the 2012 figures in June next year. It's almost 2 years after the fact. So it's a frustration, and I think that must be a frustration that's repeated at a local level as well in terms of the lack of real-time information. I guess technology, is beginning to play a role here, and obviously, when waste is collected, it's weighed. I think the trucks are becoming more sophisticated. They can weigh the amount of material. It might not be able to be sophisticated enough to tell you how much of that was actually recyclable, because obviously there's contamination and other issues, people putting the wrong plastics in and that kind of thing. But there may be things that I'd be guided by local government colleagues really as to what they feel would be appropriate. But certainly the point that was made about the kind of annual reporting versus real time, I set the point that the more up-to-date the information is, the more likely it is that you can affect change quickly rather than waiting for the information to emerge a year later, which can be slow up the process.
The climate change figures take anything up to 20 months to deliver, so it certainly is a challenge. Claudia Beamish, the short supplementary.
Minister, could I ask, Environment Link have highlighted 2 points. One, what new projects there are within this particular first 5-year programme. And then beyond that, in oral evidence, Jim Dempster highlighted from Environment Link is there work being done by government beyond the 5 years? Because obviously a lot of this is very long-term projects, which you've just highlighted yourself. So I wonder if you could clarify on new projects and whether there's work being done already beyond the 5 years.
Well, I mean, what we've done in developing the programme as it stands, we've trawled through government. We've asked colleagues in all departments to sort of reflect on the risk assessment and the impact on them. So critical infrastructure, for example, sort of power systems, those kind of issues, and then feedback to us what steps can be taken, what steps will be taken to try and address that. So there will be things going on. I'm not familiar with how much of that is new, and maybe we can come back to. I don't know whether colleagues can advise on that, but certainly what we've done is gone around all the different portfolios and agencies and said, look, tell us, how this is going to impact on you in terms of risk assessment, how it impacts on the business, and give us a sense as to steps that are being taken and can be taken for the adaptation programme. So in respect to those kind of issues, and sorry, the second point.
Long-term, beyond the 5 years,
apologies.
Planning, because in your own words,
absolutely. I mean, the first step. I mean, there are a number of initiatives. Obviously, RPP2 is longer term than the sort of the 5-year period, and there are a number of measures in there in terms of which are mainly aimed at mitigation, clearly, but there are some measures which are also addressing adaptation. We're taking very long-term investments in areas like peatland, for example, which it will not stop, and I'd be the first to admit it will not stop the biggest floods by any means. I'm not suggesting it would. 1 in 200-year flood is an exceptional event, and it's unlikely that restoring peatland would have a dramatic impact on that, but we can use natural flood management and long-term investments like forestry planting and things to try and take the edge off flood risks in local catchments. So those are kind of examples of real practical long-term investments making the farming for a better climate is as much about adaptation as it is about mitigation. So it's making farms more resilient in the longer term. So that's another example of things that we're doing in the long term. And on areas like, which are kind of work in progress, areas like coastal erosion, we're trying to do the kind of background research to understand the risks that the IPCC report might mean for Scotland in terms of areas increased risk of coastal erosion, increased risk of coastal flooding, the kind of infrastructure we saw damaged last Christmas in some of our historic harbours and ports, which were affected by a very extreme weather event. But that could be, because we're talking about sea level rises, could become a more regular occurrence. So these are things which are, we are looking at the longer term and doing the underpinning research we need to do to inform that.
Right, Tim, a very final quick point on this from Graham Day.
Yeah, Mr. In terms of implementing what we learn, or rolling out successful pilot projects, what are the pathways for actually doing that across the country? In terms of pilot projects, I mean, we've I suppose in a number of areas we are, looking at sort of land use strategy. We've got land use framework pilots which are being done in 2 areas, Scotland borders and Aberdeenshire, which are going to help inform, taking into account issues like climate change and adaptation, how we reform our sort of land use going forward. We have got, I suppose, our network of farming for better climate farms that are looking and piloting, if you like, approaches to dealing with the environment, which are based both in terms of different types of agriculture but also different locations. So we've got a network there that's giving us information which is hopefully relevant to different interest groups. We've had Climate Challenge Fund pilot projects in, as I say, in Loch Boysdale, and I don't know, can you remember the other site? But we can come back to the committee on that. There were two pilots there which hopefully we're learning from in terms of rolling out adaptation to climate challenge. So there's a lot of experimentation needing to be done. It's a new area for us clearly in many respects, and so it's important we do pilot and evaluate the impact of these measures and then roll them out. I guess what I'm getting at is that are we already thinking about the next phase, which is what we learn from these, how are we going to implement it, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Are we thinking of that now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very confident that is a key area for us. I don't know whether Neil Ritchie would like to comment on work that's going on flooding and that kind of area where we're exploring. All right, okay, apologies, we'll maybe come back to that. Neil will have his moment.
It was just a general point, really.
Yeah, but I think, it's an important point, because we do need to learn, and we need to be evidence-based in terms of our policy, and mindful always that in times of constrained financial resources, we cannot afford to waste money, unnecessarily. So we do need to experiment, and sometimes that means there's a risk involved. It may fail. You try something innovative, it may fail. It's important to innovate in policy, but it's vital, as you indicate, that we learn from that quickly and then don't repeat that mistake and move on to something else that we feel might work better. So I can give you assurance that in terms of framing our policy, that is an approach I personally take to it, and I'm sure other ministers and officials will do too.
We'll float quickly onwards towards land use and natural environment. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, you've already touched on a number of issues that relate to land use, but particularly the committee would like to look at natural environment and strengthening ecosystems. And in evidence, the committee heard a number of witnesses, including Professor David Patterson, Executive Director of the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology Scotland, and Professor Des Thompson of Scottish Natural Heritage, about the multiple benefits of building healthy ecosystems, such as, I would add biodiversity and a whole range of issues that we have other targets for as well, while adapting to climate change. Witnesses also suggested there was a need for different agencies and businesses to come together to see how best to deliver healthy ecosystems in Scotland and to help to resolve tensions. Could I ask, is there more that can be done in the adaptation programme to reflect the opportunities available to Scotland to strengthen Scotland's ecosystems?
Well, I concur with you that it's an important topic. I mean, and the points that have been made by Des Thompson and others about needing to work collaboratively, I think are absolutely key, because if we are, through biodiversity strategy, moving towards a system where we look at more sort of ecosystem level or landscape scale, put in simple terms, conservation projects, which, having multiple benefits, whether it's obviously restoration of habitats themselves, but we know that by restoring habitats we can have impact on species as well. So there's often the best way of helping a species is to improve the habitat in which it's located. That can be a very constructive thing to do. We will need multiple partners and agents to deliver that. So there have been some very good examples of this in practice. I suppose the RSPB's project, Force and Air, is obviously a peatland restoration project. It's a very large project involving more than one landowner, in this case RSPB and Lord Thurso. So there's a collaboration there, and we need to develop SRDP and other financial tools which can support that from government, and in a way that we understand what incentivises those private sector or third parties to come on board and support us in delivering these ecosystem level projects. So you're absolutely right, Ms Beamish, that those kind of projects can also have big adaptation benefits. So they might be, the primary objective might be biodiversity or for habitat restoration, but by restoring, say, a wetland or an upland peat bog or blanket bog, you can then impact on issues like flood risk and other environmental benefits for communities that are maybe further downstream. So we need to be sophisticated. We have got constrained resources. We need to look for multiple benefits, but we also need to understand how we bring in multiple partners and get that collaborative working that you've called for.
So will there be analysis done of when there are possibilities of multiple benefits as to what effect, for instance, a biodiversity project's having on climate adaptation?
I think that would be important consideration for any evaluation of the next SRDP as it's going forward. I mean, certainly in terms of the screening process for projects, we will be looking increasingly for multiple benefits where we can get them. In some cases that might not be appropriate. It may be appropriate to have a kind of a single focus on a project. So I'm not saying I want to shut out projects where they're very good, high value, good quality projects, but where we have choices, I think we will probably be leaning towards projects that can deliver multiple benefits, and therefore we need to evaluate whether those multiple benefits were achieved and what their impacts were in areas such as biodiversity and adaptation. So I entirely take on board the message, and I'll certainly make sure that we feed that into the evaluation programme for SRDP.
Moving swiftly on to the marine environment, Jamie McGregor.
Thank you. Well, Claudia Beamish mentioned Professor Thompson and Professor Patterson. Professor Thompson noted that 18% of Scotland's soft coastline is highly susceptible to erosion, and Professor Patterson suggested that coastal partnerships have a strong role to play and that greater strategic support for coastal partnerships is required if they are to deliver a goal. Now, one of the concerns, Minister, raised by witnesses was that it is often unclear who or which body is responsible for what action when faced with challenges or responding to events. And how effectively does the programme reflect the challenges and opportunities to build the resilience of Scotland's coastal communities, and what more, if anything, could be done, and is there scope for greater strategic support for coastal partnerships, which I mentioned?
Well, as I said earlier on, I think it's one of the areas where it's kind of a work in progress. We are, I've got some evidence internally about the risk of coastal erosion, and obviously we need to evaluate the, if we're looking further forward, as the point that Claudia Beamish was raising about not just the short term but the longer term, what sort of impact that might have on flood risk, coastal flood risk. So there's two separate things. You've got erosion, the risk of erosion from the sort of ongoing action of the tides and so forth, but also the risk of coastal flooding. And we need to reflect on kind of evidence that Des Thompson was talking about and the IPCC's report implications for Scotland specifically. We need to drill down into that and plan for it. I mean, I'm due to hopefully have in the near future a briefing session from Alex Hill and his colleagues at the Met Office on the specific implications for Scotland of the IPCC report, and we will start to drill down into these sort of issues. As to whether I think we need to take a more concerted approach in particular communities that are vulnerable, I think that would be a sensible thing to explore, how we can take forward a kind of coordinated approach to looking at whether we know there are vulnerabilities that are revealed by the kind of analysis we're now doing, and see if there are additional steps we need to take to protect those communities or vital economic assets from risks. So it is a work in progress. I'd be happy to engage with Mr McGregor on this if it's an area of interest to him, but certainly it's an issue that I think we need to do further work on.
I wanted to ask earlier if government advice to councils is going to be that it might be inadvisable to build on floodplains. And in that relation, is there a distinction made between flooding caused by rising sea levels and coastal communities and flooding in inland caused by rainfall and snowmelt?
Well, clearly, you're right to pick out that these are kind of impacts that we would expect to see from climate change, that there will be sort of more erratic kind of weather conditions. We'll have more extreme rainfall events, which will then increase the risk of fluvial and pluvial flooding, and then obviously separately we have sea level rises and those kind of implications for coastal flooding. We will, there's a number of things I will bring in, I think Neil Ritchie, if I may, convener just a minute on the issue about how we are already taking climate risks into account when we're planning coastal, flood protection schemes. But it's worth highlighting in the document itself, the programme on page 24, there are in the table N220 assess and manage coast. There are some measures that are specifically set out. I won't go through them in detail, but just for the committee's benefit, there are some steps identified there through the National Marine Plan and other measures where we are already factoring in, if you like, that we have to assess when there's maybe a project taking place, whether it would have an implication for coastal flooding somewhere else. So, in simple terms, the displacement of water in the event of a flood event, if you've put in a defence in one place, does it create problems further up or down the coast from that site, and take these matters into account? So we are having to become more sophisticated and take additional factors into account in marine planning and in terms of the planning process on terrestrial context because of climate change and the adaptation issues that you refer to.
Scotland has in the region of 60 inhabited islands. Have you identified, well, I'm sorry, it may be more, but anyway, we have a lot of islands. Have you identified the ones which are most vulnerable to rising sea levels?
We are in the process of doing that, convener, in terms of the work that I referred to that we're doing internally, which in due course hopefully we will be able to sort of share with the committee, is beginning to unpack those sort of issues. We know there are some local authorities where they will face a greater risk than others, and just for example, there are low-lying islands like the US, for example, where we know there are already coastal erosion issues and severe impacts from winter storms. So clearly, with rising sea levels, more volatile weather conditions, these are areas that will be more vulnerable. So we need to understand exactly, and this is why I want to meet Alex Hill and Professor Stephen Belcher and others in the Met Office to unpick these issues and see exactly what the implications are for particular localities. But we're beginning to do the work on issues like coastal erosion to understand the impact of sea level rises and how that would translate at Scotland level, and therefore the impact it will have on local communities, whether it's in the Shetland Islands, whether it's in the US and other places where there are low-lying territories, and also the kind of heritage assets that would be vulnerable as well. So it's not just communities and businesses that are at risk here. We have some of our most important tourism and heritage assets and areas like the Western Isles and the Northern Isles that may be vulnerable to rising sea levels and the kind of damage that we can expect.
Thank you, convener.
That's good. There's a number of aspects about water and all the rest of it that we will come to. Nigel Don, I think you had a question there at the very end of our list. Could you have a look at that just now, please?
Yes, okay, so you'd like me to carry on the flooding issue?
At the moment, yeah, with your question at the end, yeah.
Yes, okay.
I think it flows better.
It does indeed, thank you very much. The Minister will be aware, of course, of the Flooding Disadvantage in Scotland report. I'm strictly warned not to mention my own location, and actually I won't, precisely because it's very clear from this report that there are very many other places in Scotland where they have very much larger potential social outcomes of flooding. I'm just wondering whether you can give me some thoughts as to how you as a Minister and the Government are trying to work the information which is being revealed in there about the real risks to communities, not just of water coming past the door, but the consequences of that, the consequences to the society that that flood will leave behind. To what extent is the government able to incorporate that information in the adaptation plan?
Well, I think you know, we've made much in Scotland, both across the Parliament and indeed government, of the work we're doing on areas like climate justice in an international sense. The report that we have published recently on the impact on vulnerable communities in terms of flood risk is sort of effectively taking a domestic look at these sort of issues. We know that by dint of you know, history, we have many communities where those at principal risk of flooding are in lower income groups, they are in poor quality housing, they are in vulnerable areas, and so we need to reflect on that and prioritise our investment to help those who are most vulnerable and least able to help themselves, if I can put it in those terms. So I think the kind of the report that we've just published, which I think is significant, didn't get an awful lot of pick-up in the media, to pick up on Mr. MacDonald's point, but it is a very significant report, and it's really looking at you know, drilling down into, we know that roughly 34% of neighbourhoods are in some way exposed to some level of flood risk, but when we drill down, we find effectively it narrows down to about 2.8% of neighbourhoods in Scotland that are very severely disadvantaged in flooding. And so that informs our thinking, our policy going forward. We can target our efforts to ensure that those communities are given a high priority in terms of tackling the flood risks they face, and where we can't implement a flood protection scheme, we need to help those communities tackle, for technical reasons perhaps, we need to help them tackle it in other ways, whether it's property level protection and other approaches.
Presumably those are conversations you will have with the local authorities, who I'm assuming, and this is a question, are the bodies who are really best placed to deal with that kind of...
Indeed, we do have a partnership approach with COSLA on issues, as you're aware. I think from previous discussions, Mr Don's aware, the delivery of flood funding for flood protection schemes is done in partnership with COSLA, and therefore our understanding of this will help inform those discussions with them as to which communities need to be prioritised. But it's early days. We are building up the evidence base. I hope that report helped as a useful contribution, and we are providing more local information for local authorities, so they are able to assess at a finer degree of granularity where the issues arise. And it's feeding into obviously a publication of updated flood risk maps as well, which will come in due course. I don't know whether Neil Ritchie can advise on the timescale for that. But
yes, the flood risk and hazard maps, which are currently being produced by SEPA, will be published at the turn of the year.
And they will also look, convener, they will also look, excuse me, in terms of both the velocity and the depth of water as well. So we're taking a more sophisticated approach to the mapping now, so we can advise as to the rate at which the water may flow through an area that's at flood risk, and therefore the potential dangers to citizens.
Yeah, in that context, of course, there's not only the social implications, but there's the financial implications, and I return sadly to the continuing issue of flood insurance. One of the things that was perhaps somewhat unexpectedly suggested last week by one of our witnesses was that an independent Scotland, which he raised, might actually find it more difficult to insure floods, which seems at odds to my understanding that actually we have less of the risk. Could the Minister advise me on that?
Absolutely correct. I mean, I did read that evidence with somewhat incredulity, because Scotland has 1 in 6 of our domestic properties, or 1 in 22 of our domestic properties in Scotland are flood risk, according to one measurement. On a similar basis in England, it's 1 in 6. England and Wales, I should say, 1 in 6, about 1 in 18 in Northern Ireland. So, I think obviously in the current development of a product the UK government has brought forward, and we welcome that as progress, but we weren't involved in the discussion on that. We have had separate parallel discussions with the likes of the ABI, who have welcomed very much the approach that Scotland has taken in terms of our investment in flood protection. I would just point out that we, in broad terms, the best estimate we can provide, we fund about 3 times as much flood protection work per property at flood risk in Scotland than is done in England and Wales. So we're making the investments. We have the Flood Risk Management Act, which I think the ABI very warmly welcomed. It's a very good piece of legislation that is informing us taking a very strategic approach at Scotland level, both to managing flood risk, but also to informing investment decisions with COSLA about which flood protection schemes we fund. And I'm very confident that, that we would, insurance works on the basis of risk, after all, and Scotland has a far lower risk in terms of the number of our share of our domestic properties that are at risk of flooding. So I think if the witness was suggesting that we'd have more of a problem in developing flood insurance, I think he misunderstands the nature of the insurance market.
Jamie McGregor.
Well, just on that the thing I asked you before, Commissioner, about advice to councils about not building on floodplains. You made the point that individuals are responsible for the protection insurance of their own property, which I understand. But if somebody goes and buys a house on a floodplain, which has been, albeit it could only be a 100-year flood or 200-year flood even, it's liable that those very old floodplains are presumably, if global warming or the effects of global warming go on, that they may be reduced to maybe 25 years or 100 years from 200 years or 100 years. Do you take my point on that? I mean, are you prepared to tell councils not to build on floodplains?
Well, I should stress at the point when you raised it previously, I apologise to Mr McGregor, that there is already additional levels of protection against development on floodplains. I take the point about old floodplains and perhaps them becoming more active in the future, and that's something we need to take into account. I absolutely recognise that point. But in respect to existing identified flood risk areas, PVAs or potentially vulnerable areas, there is already a degree of scrutiny of any application that comes in, say for a residential property. In communities I'm familiar with, I've seen some applications come in which are looking at conversion of office and commercial premises to residential premises in town centres that are vulnerable to flooding. They are given an additional test. They come before ministers in some cases to determine whether this is actually appropriate use of that property given the flood risk in the area, and then we've got an opportunity to feed in. So I certainly have sight of some of these where it's relevant to me. But it's something there is already additional. We can get some, by correspondence convener, some further detail of what steps are already in the planning system from colleagues in planning and local government to protect against that risk. But obviously I take the point entirely on board that Mr McGregor makes about areas of the country becoming more at risk in future through climate change, and we need to be responsive to that.
Thank you very much.
I think we'll just deal with the marine environment bit and food and so on just in a minute or two, because we'll follow this theme about risk and emergency responses.
Thank you very much, Convener. We heard from Scottish Fire and Rescue, SEPA, etc., regarding some of the work they're doing to respond to issues like flooding, and also we heard about things like mountain rescues, teams, farmers working with local authorities. I'm also aware of Lothian's RAINET radio enthusiasts working with actual Scottish Borders Council to actually provide resilience backup in case of large emergencies happening and communications going down. So, Minister, I'd be quite interested what you think the draft adaptation programme does to support development of these sorts of partnerships between the traditional emergency services and the many volunteer organisations that are out there, and individuals, of course.
Well, at one level, thank you for raising the point. At one level, I think it provides an overarching sort of framework, but clearly we need to get buy-in to that framework and get local authorities and others who have that kind of local contact with local groups to build on that. So there's an element of government setting a kind of an overarching framework, but we clearly want this to be reflected on at local level in terms of strategies that are developed at local level. I'm aware, as Jim Hume has identified, a number of very good examples where sort of community resilience is already in effect working with local fire, local police, and I've seen at first hand the operation of the SCORE process where we have a local authority emergency response working with police, fire, health colleagues to respond to particular incidents, whether it's in Stonehaven and Mr Don's constituency or indeed in other areas of Scotland. We have had a very concerted effort, and there's definitely a kind of Team Scotland approach that's deployed at that level, and obviously at a local authority level as well. There seems to be a very strong degree of coordination of the response. So I think there's much we can do. I think you very helpfully point out there are local community groups that maybe 4x4 clubs and mountain rescue teams, which are vital parts of that infrastructure as well, and can have a very positive role to play. They're very simple. You mentioned communications. The very simple things we can do. I wasn't aware and didn't think about it, but obvious when you think about it that in the event of a power outage, the hands-free phones we have, and indeed our mobile phone coverage would be down probably in about half an hour, because the masts themselves are needing power to keep them going. The modern communication technology we rely on today is not resilient in many cases in this kind of instance. So giving information out, these groups are vital in getting that information out to people, particularly vulnerable people, elderly, those who are disabled, who need help from outside, that they should have maybe a traditional phone that's connected by a cord to the phone line, so that they're able to still continue to receive calls, because that will still be up and running in the event of a power outage, whereas the kind of hands-free phones will be instantly inactive. So there's a lot of work we need to do from government down to the local community level to get these messages out, and I thank Jim Hume for raising the point.
That's okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. We've got the marine environment question, I think, that Claudia Beamish has been waiting patiently to ask quickly.
Thank you. Minister, we've had discussion about coastal erosion and effects on communities and island communities. I'd like to ask more broadly about the marine environment and marine ecosystems, just really to seek reassurance from you today in relation to such issues as algae bloom and feeding grounds for birds, and not in any detail, but just that these issues are, I know that within the programme, the adaptation programme, they are actually highlighted in N3 to such and such, and also on page 30 there's the point about the development of the Marine Atlas and keeping that up to date. But these are all things that are going to take funding, and including marine research with all the different developments that are happening. And I wonder if you could comment on that for us today.
Well, certainly I recognise that, that the marine environment is going to be a key part of that. As I'm sure Claudia Beamish knows, because I know she's very familiar with the IPCC report, that the evidence is that much of the heat that has been generated has been absorbed by the upper ocean, but more laterally the lower ocean as well, and that's going to have significant impacts. It's one of the things that's contributing to the accelerated rate of thermal expansion of the seas, and therefore a slightly higher rate of sea level increase than we had previously factored in. So these are things which are very important. I think initially there had been some suggestion that sea level rises would be about 2 millimetres per year, but we're seeing in some cases 6 millimetres per year. So clearly the marine environment is absorbing a lot of this, the impacts of global climate change, and that's one of the reasons why there had been a slower rate of increase in surface temperatures for a period. It's thought that the ocean was absorbing a lot of that energy, but it will start to go through a new phase. So clearly the marine environment is very important. That will have impacts in terms of the ones that you've described, in terms of algal blooms. The risk to shellfish growing from algae is clearly a big risk, and so we will look at some of these issues through the context of sector approaches like the Ministerial Group Sustainable Aquaculture. We'll need to take into account these issues in wild fishery. Clearly the temperature of rivers is having an impact already on the health of our wild fisheries. So these are just a couple of examples, but you're right to identify, Claudia Beamish is right to identify that issues like the feed for seabirds we know is being impacted, and therefore it's very important we reflect that in our marine plan. The marine protected areas obviously includes some coverage for the sand eel population, which will be very important to the puffins that I know Claire Baker is a champion for, and other species. So these are important measures. I accept that there is some criticism from outside about our approach in some of these areas, but we are doing what we feel we can to try and to help our natural environment adapt to climate change, and obviously to try and mitigate that climate change in the first place.
Are you confident, Minister, that there is the funding there for those major challenges?
Well, certainly in terms of things like development of marine atlas, marine planning, there's quite a lot of additional resource going into sort of understanding of marine issues, partly because of the need to study marine environment for renewables investment and other areas. We're getting some external finance coming into that, which will help maintain and build our capacity to understand some of the marine environment issues that we face. But I take on board the point, and I will certainly make sure that I relay that to my colleague Richard Lockhead, if you raised that point at committee today.
Digging into the food and agriculture area now. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. I want to raise some issues around food and the climate adaptation plan. I mean, I think increasingly people are identifying there's a contradiction between Scotland's ambitious export food and drink figures with increasing levels of food poverty at home. And Nourish Scotland have raised some concerns that the adaptation programme doesn't, well, they said it fails to address issues around food and food resilience. And I think when we look at, I think they've got a fair point, if we look at the pressures on future food markets and the predicted volatility in prices on a global scale, I mean, how do you respond to the criticism that the adaptation plan doesn't address those issues adequately? And an understanding that it is a draft, will there be an intention to look at this again? Is there an intention to look at this again?
Well, it's a very fair point. I mean, I suppose the agri-food sector and indeed the wider food supply chain is perhaps one of the more obvious examples which they should have a very strategic interest in this issue, both in terms of the direct food production part of it, in terms of agri-sector, and indeed, as we just discussed, sort of aquaculture and or indeed our sea fisheries. These are all sectors that have a profound there's a profound importance. So climate change will have a direct impact on the production of food and drink in Scotland. Clearly also society needs to be aware, businesses, retailers need to be aware that climate change will have potentially hugely profound impacts on the supply chain globally. So some of the food stuffs that we take for granted in this country may be vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and we need to understand that as consumers. That needs to inform our decision as consumers as to how we behave clearly, but also buyers, retailers need to be aware that they've got an interest in dealing with climate change, because it's going to impact on their future viability as a business in many cases. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot we can do domestically as well, and I know because of the members' debate that you held about in support of Fife Diet, and I think very important, one of the biggest local food initiatives there is in Europe. I know the work of sort of Nourish Scotland and others, they are looking at these issues in terms of the sustainability of our food supply chain, and I think these are very important issues to take into account. So if there's recommendations that the committee have in these areas, I would be happy to look at them in terms of how we reflect on those in the adaptation programme. I know Pete Ritchie and others have been to give evidence to the committee on these matters, and it's clear that you know, we need to kind of maintain and if possible, enhance our efforts in terms of supporting reduction in food waste, because clearly that's grossly inefficient as a society and wasting the amount of food we do. We need to try and promote local food where possible. Obviously, there are certain strictures in terms of procurement process and things, but we can do more to make people aware of the local food opportunities they have, local farmers markets, local initiatives to support that. And clearly we can also help in promoting seasonal food and making sure people are aware that it shouldn't be normal to expect to have excuse me, strawberries throughout the year or other products throughout the year, that they should be sensitive to and be aware that, yes, you can get very good strawberries in Scotland grown in, no doubt, in Mr Day's constituency, and raspberries, indeed, one of my favourites, that there are great products in Scotland, but there are also ones being flown in from around the world, and you know, they need to be aware of that and the vulnerability we have as a society to continue to depend on that 24-hour-a-day access to foods that are, frankly, you know, coming from halfway around the world. The point about exports, food exports, I recognise that, you know, Scotland has a tremendous record as a food exporter ourselves. You know, there will, in the kind of markets we are dealing with for like salmon, it tends to be that Scottish produce is seen as a high quality kind of luxury, healthy sort of food alternative. There are local aquaculture industries that are developing around the world in the developing countries, and we're doing what we can as a government to support through the likes of the Institute of Aquaculture at Stirling University, James Hutton Institute and others, informing the understanding in those developing countries how they can develop their own domestic aquaculture sector for tropical fish and other species which are more relevant there. So we're not, you know, we're not keeping it all to ourselves. We are helping other societies as well to become more resilient in terms of their own food supply. But there's certainly a lot we can do domestically, I think, to try and promote local seasonal foods and to help with a domestic supply chain.
So the Minister then look again, in terms of this being a draft, will there be a further look at the adaptation plan about whether food needs to play a more central role in
Well, I would certainly welcome in it if there's any thoughts the committee have. You know, you've heard a lot of evidence and you've consulted directly with Mr Ritchie and others on these issues. If you feel there are messages that think about, I would certainly look at them and see if we can take them on board in developing the adaptation programme. And I think that's a good use of the committee's expert witnesses that you brought in. So I'll look with interest at what you come forward with, and any specific proposals, we'll look at them sympathetically.
Moving swiftly on to two supplementaries in this, Graham Day first of all, and then Richard Lyle, and then for the next question.
Thank you, Convener. In terms of agriculture's contribution to our adapting to climate change, N3.1 of the draft adaptation programme talks of implementing the EU reform of the CAP, but I think I'm right in saying that the draft will have been pulled together at a time when we assume the CAP might turn out to be greener than in reality it will be. If that's the case, how much of a handicap will the limited greening of the CAP actually be to our efforts?
Well, it's a very valid point. Clearly, we are. I'm sure Graham Day knows in a position that none of us, I suspect, around the table would like to be in with the kind of level of funding we have for agri-environment schemes and also through Pillar 1, a lower allocation than we would, I'm sure, all like to see in Scotland. But you know, we have to reflect, and it may well be that we have to finesse the strategy to some degree to reflect the circumstances as the detail emerges about what level of funding is available. You're right to say, Mr Day, that the expectations were initially that there would be much greater emphasis on greening in CAP than has actually been delivered, it would appear. But we do have a degree of, obviously, you know, the ability to be flexible in terms of Scotland, in terms of how we allocate resources, and we're looking, obviously, through initiatives like SRDP to try and the next SRDP to try and help make our natural environment more resilient through investment in the type I was talking earlier on, using the influence of land managers at a local level to try and develop ecosystem-wide approaches that deliver the kind of multiple benefits that we were discussing earlier. So I am hopeful that we can still make progress, but clearly we're not in a position that I think either we expected to be, or certainly that I would like to be in, that we should have, I believe, far more resource available to Scotland to deliver greening measures in our agricultural sector.
Convener, we've touched on food, but basically this question could be for everything. You've said that we need to change local councils' tender on quality and price. Some contracts, the firms are actually quite far away, the winners of the contracts. Should we actually be looking to change regulations to allow councils to give preference to local food sources? Because in a recent survey done by an organisation called APSE, Association of Public Service Excellence, £1 locally spent generated £1.60 into the local economy.
Well, clearly, I certainly think it's an important question that Richard Lyle raises, because not least as someone who is a Minister for Crofting, I would like to see our crofters get a fair crack of the whip when it comes to public sector procurement. And obviously there's a lot of work we can do to help crofters work collaboratively to market themselves. So I'll not get into that just now, but I think the more we can do through procurement to secure local contracts for local businesses and local companies and farmers, I think that will have very positive benefits, as Lyle quite identifies, at a local level in terms of recycling that money through the local economy. The multiplier will be high, potentially higher than it would be if it's being procured from further afield. So obviously, getting into techie language, the more you can reduce leakages of money out of an economy, the more prosperous that economy becomes, and more the positive kind of cycle kind of happens. So we do face certain strictures in terms of European procurement rules, clearly. I know there is ongoing engagement as part of the background to the sort of procurement legislation that the government is taking forward to discuss with partners in Europe and elsewhere about how we can maximise the opportunities for Scotland. But it's not my portfolio, so I may have to come back with a written submission on that point, if I may, Mr Lyle, just as to what we can do in terms of the legal position.
Thank you very much. Moving rapidly on to the infrastructure and built environment. Nigel Dawn.
Thank you very much, Convener. The UK Committee on Climate Change, I think, raised some concerns about our ability to make good decisions about where major developments were sited. The Minister's already made some comments about his conversations with Mr Mackay about planning of new settlements, but the siting, for example, of wind turbines and renewable energy facilities in general, a lot of money going into the ground, quite literally, in broadband. To what extent is the government able to ensure that these are that the effects of climate change are at least thought about in where these things are sited, please?
Well, I mean, certainly it's. I would expect. I mean, I would expect, Convener and Mr Don, that we have a situation where it's not a secret that the government has clearly quite ambitious climate change targets. That is local government, through its contribution through single outcome agreements and the climate change duty, have a responsibility to deliver that, deliver on that at local level. And I have every confidence, as I outlined earlier, that that message is well recognised and local government is doing a lot of good things. Clearly, it then feeds through into issues that were picked up, I think, initially by Claire Baker and Jamie McGregor about the planning system and how we then reflect that at a local level. Now, there are clearly decisions that can be taken at a local level. There may be competing interests. So in some respects, for example, undergrounding of cables for renewables projects will be called for by many communities because of the reduced visual intrusion impact of that. But we need to be prepared to examine and this is something that SNH would do as a statutory consultant, and SEPA would do as statutory consultees in the planning process, look at the impact on hydrology, peatlands, which are obviously very important in terms of sequestering carbon emissions. So we do have to be, I suppose, smart about how we develop infrastructure at a local level and make sure that it is sensitive to many, many factors, including biodiversity, climate change impacts, hydrology, and that is the kind of role that SNH and SEPA fulfil on a day-to-day basis in assessing all planning applications. And clearly they are very aware of adaptation and climate mitigation drivers for government and will reflect that in terms of how they deliver. But I don't know whether it might be appropriate to bring in Neil, give him a bit of a workout on how we take into account from say SEPA's perspective how they would take adaptation issues into account in framing their response to any planning application.
Yeah, I think it's SEPA and the other statutory consultees will look at the range of the factors that are involved. So, for example, in terms of wind farm developments, they would assess and validate the carbon calculator assessment which the developer had identified as part of their application. And I think it's also relevant to reflect that in addition to the planning regime per se and that decision-making, that process, we've also got other, where it's relevant, actions will be considered, such as environmental impact assessments, which will all help the decision makers, be it the planning authority or others, to make the rounded, informed decision. And just picking up on the point the Minister alluded to earlier in terms of the flooding example, the flood risk strategies which are currently being developed build into them climate change projections for the future. So the impact in the future of climate change in a number of areas is embedded into the decisions we are taking now.
Okay. I'm wondering if I might extend that then to the issue of the necessary skills in our workforce to deal with many of the things that we've talked about. I'm just wondering whether the Minister's had any conversations with his colleagues within education, the Cabinet Secretary for Lifelong Learning, and just to explore whether we are going to have the right mix of skills within our workforce to cope with what we're talking about in these programmes.
Well, certainly there are very specific proposals and discussions that have been had through the education throughout the education sector, led by the Cabinet Secretary and others, in terms of how we respond to you know, growth in low carbon economy and some of the measures that are required to develop that, specifically renewables, obviously, but other areas like zero waste, the and Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Environment, Richard Lockett, is obviously looking at developing a circular economy. So there's lots of areas in which we sort of having to adapt and change our economy to move to a more low carbon model where there's clear skills issues, and you know, we're alive to those. As to the adaptation issues, that's something I think will feed through in discussion of the adaptation programme. What kind of things fall out of that in terms of, are there skills gaps, and something, maybe it's an area that we need to look at. But I don't think to date there's been any concerted strategy, if you like, specifically related to adaptation. But I just ask Helen to confirm whether that's the case. Or Bob?
Not specifically. We would, I think, look within each policy sector to be looking at the requirements. I'm aware that when the flood legislation went through a couple of years ago, we made an initiative to get more hydrologists, the postgraduate hydrologists actually trained as a response to that. So that development does happen, but there is not an overarching adaptation education strategy, no.
But certainly it's something I can commit to, Convener, to take forward. Any bilaterals I have with the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning, I will certainly bear that in mind in terms of making sure that those issues are addressed.
Moving swiftly on to business, and not about public procurement, but Jamie McGregor, supply chains and so on, is it?
Right. Well, in evidence to the committee, David Thompson noted that he didn't see in how the objectives have been set out, how issues around resilience of businesses and especially supply chains are being dealt with. And this was also a view which was echoed by Professor Rowan as well. So how does the draft programme mitigate the risks on supply chains that are critical to businesses in Scotland?
Well, I think I've alluded to it earlier on. We're doing a lot of work with the Climate 2020 group, who are themselves looking at, well, in relation to the low carbon behaviours we're talking about earlier on. There's a lot of work they are doing to make their businesses more resilient to climate change, while also doing the mitigation work in terms of fuel efficient driving and so forth. They're also being encouraged and are looking at supply chain risks. I think I alluded to earlier on, I think I have got a concern that not enough businesses, particularly ones that we know potentially are in sectors that are vulnerable, are taking forward the message that they should be planning in their corporate strategy, their business planning. They should be looking at what risks there are to them in terms of their supply chain risk, their risk on their business directly, their property level risk, that kind of issue. So I think there's much more work needs to be done. If the committee, come forward with points they feel that are needing to be included in the climate adaptation programme, I will look at that. But we certainly are of the view that we have ongoing very strong collaboration through the Climate 2020 group in looking at these matters. But I don't know whether Helen Mansbridge would like to comment on the engagement we've had with business. I know there's been some direct response to the consultation from businesses, mainly in the energy sector, and actually the SSPO from representing the aquaculture sector fed back in. So it would be fair to say that the bulk of the responses were from public sector, voluntary sector, and interest in the likes of transport sector, which, as you can understand from a transport resilience point of view. But there were some specific business responses. But we in terms of engagement with business, Helen can maybe explain what else we're doing.
Bob,
sorry.
Yeah, two things I might actually say. I think that the government's main priority is to make sure that business is actually aware, so that it actually can do its own planning. And certainly the 2020 group is an important conduit and stimulus from that. Outside that, public bodies themselves who actually engage with business are subject to the public sector duty through the Climate Change Act to do everything that they to discharge all the functions in taking account of climate change and sustainability. So they should actually be working to support and develop business a little bit better. Specifically, we have Adaptation Scotland, who are funded directly by the Scottish Government to work with all sectors through a number of programmes to stimulate that planning, thinking, and to support and facilitate it through them. And they are active in engagement with certain business groups. Could they do more? Undoubtedly. Perhaps that is something that we should actually be looking at in once this programme is actually finalised, how we get Adaptation Scotland to develop from its present role into the future and develop a greater support for that planning and information activity.
And rapidly to the final question, Claudia Beamish.
Minister, could I focus our minds as we draw this session to a close on social justice in relation to climate change adaptation? And you will perhaps be aware that David Thompson and John Rowan suggested that the draft programme didn't adequately reflect issues associated with social vulnerability and equity. And further, in their consultation, they weren't actually able to give us oral evidence, but the John Rowntree Foundation stated, and I quote, "There is no consideration of the differential impacts of climate change across Scotland or the nature of inequalities that climate change may bring, or ensuring that fairness and equity is considered in developing responses, which may require targeted action." Now, that's quite hard-hitting, but obviously in relation to island communities and to Glasgow, which has been highlighted, and then in terms of issues like fuel poverty and food poverty, which have come up today, that is quite concerning. So could you say to what extent the climate change adaptation progress has considered social justice in developing the programme? Is there scope for further action? And is it likely that it can be equality-proofed?
Well, these are hugely important issues. As I alluded to, I think I was talking earlier on about climate justice in the international context and how it related to Scotland. And I think the work that we've done in looking at extreme flood disadvantage, which is subsequent to the publication of the consultation. So we've also got a timing issue here. To give you reassurance, there's a lot of work going on looking at the vulnerability of communities, specifically to identify those which are at the greatest flood disadvantage and therefore to help prioritise, as I was saying earlier on, prioritise our investment opportunities. So we certainly do take on board these equalities issues, the social justice issue in terms of identifying which communities, in terms of looking at the composite measure, if you like, of vulnerability. There are issues like social inclusion indicators are taken into account, the potential impacts in the community, their financial vulnerability and so forth. So these are all factors which are taken into account in forming that work. So we're taking account of the physical risk, but also the risk in terms of the ability of that community to respond and to be able to protect themselves. Because I recall when I went to Stonehaven and Mr. Don's constituency, seeing many properties that weren't protected from flooding areas, and they probably as a coincidence where properties didn't have flood insurance either. So we've got a kind of double vulnerability there. Those who are able to fund measures do so, and they're probably better protected because they're able to afford flood insurance in the first place. So these are sort of issues we need to take account of in terms of framing our policy on flood insurance and other matters. But we have to model, identify where these risks are, identify which communities are most vulnerable and act on them. There is a bit of a timing issue here, is what I'm basically saying, that we're doing a lot of that underpinning work, which is covered by the document that was published last week on the extreme flood disadvantage in Scotland by local authority, and we are informing local authorities themselves at a higher degree of granularity where those risks are within their local authority areas, so they're able to act as well. But I take on board the point, and there's an important issue here about ensuring that we look at the vulnerability of communities, the social justice dimension of it, and government and local authority partners and others can respond to that and take a lead on making sure that they are addressed.
That's helpful, Minister. Could you either today or perhaps in writing to the committee say something more about how vulnerable low-income people and particularly targeted communities that are deprived communities will get the sort of support they need not to be left behind?
Well,
not just on flooding, sorry, but on the whole
yeah, more
range
generally, I
of
take a
issues.
point, it's not just about flooding. I suppose it's the most obvious example where we know there's, for a reason, as I said, reasons of history, a lot of the poor quality housing, which is unfortunately, meant there's many communities that are low incomes are kind of left with that kind of quality housing, is in areas which are naturally prone to flooding. So, there has been a historic link, just in the same way as many of our, during the industrial evolution, many of our cities developed with the more affluent areas in the west because the prevailing wind took the smog and the smoke away from them. There are geographic, socio-economic and geographic factors which have meant that many communities have ended up being most exposed to flooding because they were lower income households taking a less good quality land at that time. So these are issues that are, from a fuel poverty point of view, probably going to be concentrations of the same communities that are probably affected by fuel poverty, are also affected by flood risk, affected by maybe transport access issues, other problems. So I totally take the board the point, and we will come back to the committee with some response to the points you've raised.
Much, Minister, and your officials for your evidence so far, and no doubt you'll be interested in our report once we reflect on this. I shall shortly be asking the public gallery to be cleared and move the meeting into private session to consider the draft budget scrutiny in 2014-15, as was agreed at last week's meeting. So thank you, everybody, and we will close the meeting to the public and move into private just now. The next meeting, the committee will have 2 evidence sessions on deer management and sign off its draft budget report, and note the informal briefing on the ECHR issue order at 9:30 tomorrow morning. So we'll have a very brief